I call Grant Robertson.
Mr Speaker, there's one member sitting in the House right now who knows all about how it feels to stop superannuation being universal, and that member is Nick Smith, because he was here in the 1990s putting on the surcharge, getting asset testing in place. If there's any member in this House who understands what it means to rip apart universal superannuation, it's Nick Smith. And that's also the record, Mr Speaker, of the National Party in terms of this piece of legislation, because let's not let anyone watching misunderstand that when KiwiSaver went through Parliament in 2006, there were one or two parties who had some concerns about it in the first reading, and the votes were a bit split. The Greens in New Zealand First supported the Labour bill all the way through. By the time we got to the third reading of the KiwiSaver Act 2006, one party left opposing it, the National Party. That was who was opposing it. And consistently, they have undermined the KiwiSaver system until we come here today, Mr Speaker, with this commitment from the National Party to take incentives for savings away from New Zealanders. Now, I went to a lot of electorate meetings during the 2014 election campaign. Wellington Central's an electorate where there are plenty of interested people who come out week after week. I think we had about 25 electorate meetings, and I listened intently every night to Paul Foster Bell, and occasionally when he was indisposed to Chris Bishop. And I listened intently at those. James Shaw was there, he'll back me up on this. And at not one of those meetings was there a reference to the fact that this would be happening, that KiwiSaver would be being undermined, that the incentive would be taken away. Not once was that mentioned in the election campaign. Not once was it mentioned in the 6 months that have occurred since then, because the National Party, in a desperate clawing bid to make next year's surplus look like it exists, have decided to do this. Because this, Mr Speaker, this measure that today will save the government $175 million next year. And what's the figure of the surplus? 176. 176. So there's a $1 million. You've heard about the Swedish rounding that happens when you're at the supermarket and they round up and down. Well, this is the English rounding to get you to a surplus, a $1 million one after the 175's been counted from this. Mr Speaker, this is a broken promise. This is a broken promise alongside a series of other broken promises in the budget. The surplus one. The fact that there'd be no new taxes, to which we will come very shortly. Apparently, no new taxes. Now we've got three. Another broken promise. Debt. John Key stood up in this House and said debt would be paid down. Debt will be paid down this year. No, it won't. In fact, the budget documents tell us, Mr O'Connor, it'll be 2019 until any debt will be paid down. It'll be $93 billion by 2019 as well. That's another broken promise, and this bill is a broken promise. And at this time in the economic cycle, this is the thing that New Zealanders will come to understand. This is as good as it gets. 3% growth this year, down to 2.4% by the end of the forecast cycle. Dairy prices aren't recovering. There's no sign of a plan to grow exports. They're flatlining as well. This is as good as it gets. And at the time when it's as good as it gets, what do National do? Take to KiwiSaver. That's their plan. There's no plan to grow the economy in this budget today. What we've got is a political management budget rather than a budget to grow the economy. And if there was any symbol of that more, Mr Speaker, it would be this bill. A bill that takes away from the future, that steals from future generations $1,000. If there was any look to the future in this bill, it would be about initiatives to increase savings. It would be about initiatives to go, oh, here we go, more spending from David Bennett. This is $1,000 to give people some dignity in retirement. Mr Bennett, have you got KiwiSaver? He's the one who does it. He's the one over there who doesn't have KiwiSaver. The rest of them, they all took their $1,000. Todd Barclay, I think he was about 2 years old when the bill went through. Todd Barclay, he got his $1,000. He got his $1,000, but they want to deny that to the rest of New Zealanders. At the very peak of the economic cycle, with 3% growth, in 2006 we had 3% growth in New Zealand. We had a surplus of billions and unemployment under 4%. Now, with a growth rate of 3%, we've got a deficit and we've got unemployment nudging up towards 6%. This is as good as it gets. It goes downhill from here, and the economy, there is no plan to grow the economy on the other side of the house, Mr. Speaker. That's right, a great combination, Mr. Hipkins. The thing about KiwiSaver, Mr. Speaker, is that it has been an enormous success. And in 2008, when the National Party came in, they had already worked out, after opposing it in 2006, that it was an enormous success. So they made the commitment there'll be no major changes. Well, there's been 8. This is the 8th of them, another broken promise, a series of broken promises. But they said there'd be no major changes. And that's because KiwiSaver has been a runaway success. Every member of this House will recognise that New Zealand's savings rate over many generations has been poor. We have not been good savers. One of Michael Cullen's many significant legacies to this country is that he took the initiative to turn that around. And despite John Key standing up in Parliament in 2006 and saying that Michael Cullen was dreaming, deluded and in la-la land if he thought a quarter of New Zealanders would have KiwiSaver, it has vastly exceeded the expectation, vastly exceeded the doom-saying from John Key. And so that's why KiwiSaver has been successful. But how unfair, Mr. Speaker, that if you were lucky enough to sign up on Wednesday for KiwiSaver, you get the $1,000 kickstart. People, young families here in Wellington who I know of, who've been really excited about getting their kids involved just after they're born, signing them up. If they were lucky enough that they did that on Wednesday, great. If it was Thursday, gone. Even though the legislation hasn't even passed yet. And there were amendments put up in this House by members on this side to say, at least to the National Party, how about you give people a chance? How about we extend it out for a year or even 6 months? And that was turned down, Mr. Speaker. It was turned down because fundamentally this $1,000 kickstart has been wildly successful at encouraging people to join into the scheme. And it's those people who need the kickstart the most who will be the most affected by this. Those on low incomes. Because the truth is, the choice to become a saver is a difficult one when you're on a low income. We know that it's got a huge long-term benefit for people. We know that it's got a huge long-term benefit for people, but it's a big challenge when you're on a low income. So the $1,000 kickstart's the thing that makes the difference. Actually, someone told John Key this on the day after the budget. A young woman at a teen parent unit, I saw her on the television saying after she'd met John Key, I wanted to get into that scheme, but I just haven't had the money to do it. The $1,000 kickstart's taken away. That's exactly the person who today the National Party is ripping $1,000 out of their pocket. The other people are the younger generation. Mr. Speaker, I think it's exciting that when young babies are born, that their parents say, let's start the nest egg today. That's great. That's called building a savings habit. Cameron Bagri, the chief economist at the ANZ, doesn't often agree with the Labor Party, but he today has come out and said that's the reason why we've got the incentive, is to actually start the habit of savings. Because the problem is, if you get to 18 or if you get to 20 and you haven't got that account set up with that $1,000 in it, then there'll be much less of a chance that you'll carry on with that. So they're the two groups today. As the National Party members sit over there, they can reflect on, Mr. Speaker, who they are taking opportunity away from today. They are taking $1,000 away from those low-income earners and from those younger people. And we've had a lot of preaching from that side of the House, from their late conversion to wanting to do something about child poverty. Well, here's something you could do. Actually give people on low incomes the chance to get that $1,000 and get that savings habit underway. Mr. Speaker, this bill undermines one of the great retirement savings initiatives of New Zealand, and the National Party should be ashamed of it.
Mr. Speaker, I hear you.
I call